Support for this podcast comes from Is Business Broken, a podcast from BU's Mehrotra Institute that explores questions like, why are executives paid so much? Do they deserve it? Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Darryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. Before this year's Black History Month comes to a close, we want to share a conversation I had at WBUR's City Space. It was about civil rights hero John Lewis.
We are tired. We are tired of being beaten by policemen. We're tired of seeing our people locked up in jail over and over again. And then you holler, be patient. How long can we be patient? We want our freedom, and we want it now.
That was an excerpt from Lewis's famous speech during the March on Washington in 1963. Lewis's dedication to nonviolent resistance for equality made him a giant in the fight for civil rights in America. As a Georgia congressman who inspired people to get into good trouble, some of his colleagues referred to him as the conscience of the Congress. And check this out. His birthday is February 21st, tomorrow. Back in November, I spoke with author, historian, and Newton-native David Greenberg. He wrote a pretty detailed biography of Lewis called John Lewis, A Life. The book takes you through his family background, his upbringing in Alabama, his activism, and his last days as a beloved politician. Here, I basically asked, what made him want to write a book about John Lewis?
Well, I obviously didn't know him. I knew of him, for my generation. He was someone who came to sort of political prominence as a congressman, just as I was kind of reaching adulthood and following politics. Mm-hmm. But, his story was somewhat well known. I mean, the heroism at Selma, March on Washington. And then kind of over the years, partly through longevity and partly just through his continued outspoken assertiveness, he was kind of evolving into this iconic figure.
Yeah.
He published a memoir. He published these graphic memoirs for kids, the March trilogy, one of which won the National Book Award. I'll also say that as a historian, I've written a lot about American politics in the 20th century. I'd never written a book in which race and the struggle for racial equality was really at the center of the story. And I think most historians would tell you it is at the center of the American story. It's certainly at least one of the key central themes. So I felt this was something I wanted to take on and think about and to try to do through the life of John Lewis.
As you did that, right, with race being at the center of this story, you're a white man, right? How did you check yourself in writing this book? Because you hit on a lot of some deep racial issues in this book.
Right. Well, in any biographical effort, in any historical effort, the whole point is you have to understand people who are different from you. I could write a biography of Napoleon, and I'm not a short 19th century French general. So you go to the sources. I read everything John Lewis wrote. I read every interview with him I could find, watched video, listened to his speeches. I interviewed hundreds of people who knew him, white and black, getting their perspective, making sure that I wasn't, bringing biases or viewpoints that are blind spots to the question. What am I missing? What don't I understand? You're always asking that. Black colleagues and friends who are historians and biographers would read the work, talk to me about it. What am I missing? What am I not understanding? Because I was very much aware that not just between people of different races, I'm not a Southerner, I'm not a Christian. There's lots of ways in which I am different from him. I met with him at the start of it, and he gave me his blessing to write it, and his chief of staff, a guy named Michael Collins, who's also from the Boston area, ended up going to Morehouse College and then getting involved in, Atlanta politics, and John Lewis. They were very supportive because I think, whatever racial differences exist or differences of region or religion, there was a sort of shared understanding of John Lewis's importance and contribution. Now, some of that, my thinking about that changed and evolved as I did the research. He actually became a more complicated, intriguing, interesting person to me.
Yeah.
I was sort of worried at first. One friend of mine said, you don't want to write the life of St. Francis. Hagiography is what we call it, which literally means the life of a saint. And one, that's not interesting to anybody. But two, even though John Lewis was a saintly person, he was a human. He was not a saint.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to understand him with all his shortcomings, the mistakes he made, the friends he disappointed, as well as all the historic things he achieved.
I want to go to a question that someone had asked, kind of fast forwarding a bit. How did he meet Martin Luther King?
Okay. Well, this is actually from this period in his life too. I mean, he first discovers King on the radio. The family listens to a Montgomery, Alabama station that plays a lot of music, but on Sunday will carry sermons. And this is, I guess, just before King really rises to national prominence with the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. And he hears King giving a sermon, and he's just riveted. And he's taken with this kind of fusion, because he's I say he's a reader. His first book that he loved was the Bible. He wants to be a minister. He actually becomes a boy minister, ordained as a teenager. So he's drawn to kind of this social gospel teaching of King, but it's fused to a whole critique of segregation and of the regime of Jim Crow in the South. And he understands immediately this is what he wants to give his life to, this kind of belief system and message and cause. So after his first year, so he goes to college at a little Bible college in Nashville called American Baptist Theological Seminary. Basically, his mother, who besides working on the farm, also has to take in extra work as a washwoman, a domestic. She's working in, it's described differently in different sources, but either an orphanage or some institution, and finds just this brochure. And, it's for American Baptist. He writes away to apply. I actually got a hold of his college acceptance letter, which says, "We hope it is in God's plan for you to come and study with us." I don't know about you. I never got such a welcome letter from any college or graduate school. And so he goes off to Nashville, and he has a lot of great, interesting experiences there, but he's kind of homesick and decides he really wants to go to school near home at Troy State. Well, Troy State is all white, but he's read about students who are challenging, whether it's University of Georgia, other, segregated schools, and getting their way in. So who does he write to? Martin Luther King. Well, who can help me do this? And to his surprise, he hears back, not at first directly from King. He hears from Ralph Abernathy, who was King's lieutenant, and Fred Gray, the attorney they worked with. They invite him to Montgomery. He's ushered in to Ebenezer Church, into King's sort of office down in the basement. And there he is. I mean, talk about starstruck. 18-year-old, 19-year-old John Lewis in the presence of Martin Luther King. And he always would tell this story. He said, "My name is John Robert Lewis." And he could never remember why he said his middle name, but he did. And, they're impressed with his courage, this unassuming kid who wants to take on Troy State. And they lay out for him what's involved. But it requires his parents' cooperation, because he's 21 in Alabama. He's under 21. You need your parents' cooperation for a lawsuit. And King explains to him, your parents may not want to do this. There could be retaliation. There could be violence. They could have their credit threatened. Lots of terrible things were known to happen to people who stood up to the system. Lewis remains steadfast, but he goes then back to the farm. And when he starts telling his parents about it, he can just see it's not happening.
Yeah.
They, this becomes famous later in life. He uses this good trouble slogan. They don't like to get into trouble. Again, I think they probably hated segregation as much as he did, but their way of getting along had been just provide as well as you can for your family, trust in the church, trust and make a good life despite these oppressions. And they were not going to help him challenge. So he goes back that fall to Nashville, but if you're a believer, maybe it isn't God's plan, because that's when things really start heating up in Nashville with a group of ministers, very much allies of King and in the King style, who start up the big quest for a Montgomery bus boycott style project in Nashville that Lewis becomes a central part of, and that's the lunch counter sit-ins.
We'll be right back. And we're back with more of my conversation about John Lewis with historian and author of John Lewis, A Life, David Greenberg. Now, a little background before we jump back in. Lewis built much of his reputation through his work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. Lewis was among the college and high school students who founded the committee, which would become one of the most influential racial justice organizations in U.S. history. SNCC members put their lives on the line with peaceful demonstrations and efforts throughout the South to end Jim Crow segregation, to make way for an integrated society where Black people enjoyed the same rights and freedoms as whites. Lewis eventually became chairman of SNCC and held tightly to the ideals of peaceful resistance and integration. But some members wanted to take a more radical approach to racial justice. SNCC member Stokely Carmichael, who would later become known as Kwame Ture, embodied these attitudes in SNCC. He was outspoken, charismatic, and controversial, as he called for Black self-reliance instead of integration. Carmichael eventually challenged Lewis for SNCC's chairmanship, and this face-off led to a pivotal moment in Lewis's life. Here's more on that.
At this point, I want to play a clip from Lewis's former SNCC colleague, Stokely Carmichael, who succeeded him in his SNCC chairmanship after that devastating voting session.
Right.
That helped send him into a depression. So this is a clip to introduce you all to Stokely Carmichael from the Black Power speech that he gave in 1966 at UC Berkeley.
Now, several people have been upset because we said that integration was irrelevant when initiated by blacks, and that in fact it was a subterfuge, an insidious subterfuge for the maintenance of white supremacy. Now, we maintain that in the past 6 years or so, this country has been feeding us the latamide drug of integration, and that some Negroes have been walking down a dream street talking about sitting next to white people, and that does not begin to solve the problem. That when we went to Mississippi, we did not go to sit next to Ross Barnett. We did not go to sit next to Jim Clark. We went to get them out of our way. And that people ought to understand that we were never fighting for the right to integrate. We were fighting against white supremacy.
So that's Stokely Carmichael. And obviously, there are two radically different approaches to the fight. Yet, there was a lot of respect between Carmichael and Lewis, and even Carmichael and King. Talk about the relationship between Lewis and Stokely Carmichael, who would later become Kwame Ture, and the change that Carmichael brought to SNCC and how that challenged Lewis.
Right. So, Stokely Carmichael he's originally from Trinidad, but he's from New York. He goes to the Bronx High School of Science, where actually my daughter goes. It's, an integrated school, really high quality public school. So his background is very different from John Lewis's. He grows up not with segregation, but with other forms of racial discrimination and racism that are, nonetheless very powerful and real, obstacles and burdens. And when SNCC is formed, so the name Coordinating Committee in SNCC suggests there are all these different colleges and college towns which in 1960 have taken up the sit-in movement. So they kind of get together with representatives from each of these groups in 1960 to form what's at first thought to be a kind of temporary coordinating committee, but becomes a new organization. So many of the people in SNCC are like Lewis from the South, do have a focus on integration, see the lunch counters sit-ins as very significant. There are others, particularly a group from Howard University in Washington, D.C., many of whom are Northerners, who have a rather different ideological focus. So these divisions lead to an election for chairman where Lewis decides, I'm going to run one more time, try to keep SNCC on this path that I really believe in. To the depth of his soul, he believes in it. He's actually, sort of to his surprise, reelected after a lot of contentious argument by a pretty healthy margin. And then people go off to their bunks. It's at a retreat where they've been for a week outside of Nashville. People retire for the night. And later in the night, a few people in the other camp kind of reopen the question. And they say, how did John Lewis get reelected? We didn't agree to this. And although it seems to be against the SNCC Constitution or bylaws, but these things were never really followed, they hold a new election. And all the grievances toward John Lewis come pouring forth, that he was too pro Lyndon Johnson, that he was too pro King, that he was too churchy, that he was, that he marched at Selma on the bridge because SNCC had voted not to march. And Lewis said, well, I want to march as an individual, not as chairman of SNCC. All these things, and Carmichael is elected. So it's very disillusioning. Lewis decides to remain in SNCC, but after a couple of months, he sees enough signs that he's not really welcome. It's not the organization it used to be, and he leaves. So that's sort of the context for this split. And this becomes a real debate, among Black Americans, among Americans in general, about whether, Carmichael's radical path of a more militant approach, a more separatist approach, call it what you will, Black nationalist, versus a more integrationist vision, the King, Bayard Rustin vision of an interracial coalition. Which of these will best serve Black Americans?
We've talked a lot about Lewis, and we've kind of touched on how some of his convictions could be a flaw in a sense, right? We just talked about him being voted out of his chairmanship at SNCC. And some of the things people said that night were criticisms that seemed to pop up again and again in the book.
Yeah.
And there was one that you wrote that stuck out to me that I feel like kind of hit the nail on the head. This came after he was in Congress. This was in reaction to his book, Walking with the Wind.
Right.
Broadly, there was a positive reception, but people close to him were not really feeling it that much. This came from Muriel Tillinghast.
Muriel Tillinghast.
She was a friend of Lewis from SNCC. She considered him a decent person, but that his goal became to stay in office, which is the agenda that most politicians have. Once he was in office, he turned his back on SNCC. He was unwilling to acknowledge SNCC. I never really forgave John for that. And this is the line where I said, that's hitting something. His life bears out the detriment of getting involved in politics from the inside. That resonated with me because I think the thing that I struggled with towards the later chapters of the book was like, why would a guy like John Lewis, why would a guy who participated in the civil rights movement, who fought the establishment, got a win on the establishment, join the establishment, right?
Right.
Because I feel like somebody like that is bigger than the establishment, at least big enough to fight it. How did those criticisms hit you as an observer of his life?
I think John Lewis would say, coming out of the 60s and going into the 70s, the sense of opportunity of blacks running for office, of taking power, of holding power, whether it was as mayor, city councilman, sheriff. I mean, John Lewis loved the fact that Selma, which had this brutal sheriff, Jim Clark, he's notorious in the history books. Now all these years later, it was a guy named, I think, John Hewlett, who was one of the local Selma activists who became sheriff. And, he just thought, this is what we have to do. We have to take back. You talk about black power. Yeah, let's have power as a congressman, as a president. And of course, there's also a perspective that, well, it's a kind of power, but you're trimming your sails and you have to make compromises. And maybe these are intolerable compromises. I mean, I think Lewis struggled. I think he knew sometimes he had to go along with things he didn't like. I think he tried to, as he would say, keep your eyes on the prize, to keep in view the principles and the goals. And he, I think he would reject the notion that he was only trying to stay in power. And I think his constituents, by virtue of reelecting him, must have felt he was doing something for them. And he actually was quite good at constituent services, and he helped Atlanta become a booming metropolis, and helping its transportation and revitalizing the old Sweet Auburn historic district of Kingsholm and a lot of things like that. But I think some of these criticisms put their finger, I would say, not so much on John Lewis, but on the dilemma of, do you work from the inside or the outside? Mm-hmm. I mean, my own view is, what's pretty amazing about John Lewis is that most of us, like, if we're lucky, can make a small mark in one arena in our lifetimes. John Lewis managed to succeed in protest and then managed to succeed in politics, and in two arenas which kind of overlap, but in some ways are quite different. He managed to be, remarkably effective and even transformational. Speak well of the man. But I insisted on including in the book these criticisms because I think they are real criticisms that a number of people make. And I didn't want to write a hagiography. I wanted people to understand. He had critics from the right. He had critics from the left. People on the right thought he was too partisan a Democrat. People on the left thought he was too in bed with the establishment. But he persevered.
Mm-hmm. Well, for the last question, I have to ask this as we wrap. Trump was the only president that John Lewis called a racist. And he came in under Reagan. I thought that was interesting. I said, okay.
Well, he was not a fan of Reagan, but I never found him explicitly calling him a racist.
Yeah. You said that he said he doesn't understand the significance of civil rights. And so I would like to know, as we prepare for this Trump presidency, what purpose do you want this book to serve in this moment and in the moments moving forward?
Yeah. Well, look, as a historian, a writer, biographer, I had a goal that was not utilitarian or political. My goal was sort of to try to do justice to the life of John Lewis, to tell a man's life and the history well and truly in a way that people could learn and appreciate. That said, I do find myself kind of turning to the book, and particularly that chapter on the first Trump term and John Lewis's role for, I don't know, maybe comfort or solace or hope or inspiration. He did, I mean, he was already emerging as kind of this celebrity hero before Trump's election. But it was actually in those years, and I think the thing that kind of certified his iconhood was that he became like the anti-Trump, this antidote to Trump. There's a story right after Trump's election in 2016, and this came from, I think, a Washington Post account, but a woman is walking through the Atlanta airport just beside herself, despondent. I think probably like a lot of us couldn't sleep, waking up at odd hours, just feeling sick about Trump's election. And she sees, and he was often in the Atlanta airport, John Lewis getting a shoe shine. And John Lewis steps off the pedestal, and he comes over and he gives this woman a hug. And she tells the reporter, I felt I was going to be all right, that we were going to make it through these 4 years, or I forget her exact words. And I think Lewis, not just because of his belief in forgiveness and redemption, but also because he embodied the best of our democratic traditions and the idea that you could triumph over adversity. And he's not with us now, but if the book and if reading about and learning about the life of John Lewis today can provide some measure of that kind of hope and willingness to fight on and persevere, I would not be unhappy.
Well, David, the book is definitely a wonderful walk through history. Thank you so much for this work. Thank you for coming through the City Space to talk to us.
Thank you, Darryl. This has been a terrific conversation.
Yeah.
That was my conversation with author and Newton-native David Greenberg. He wrote the biography, John Lewis, A Life. We spoke last November. And before I let you go, this was part of a much longer conversation. So if you want to see the whole thing on video, check out our show's webpage at WBUR.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common, which is produced by myself and Franny Monahan. It's mixed by Marquise Neal, and it's edited by Yasmin Ammer. And our theme music is Me from Hisu. And from the newsroom of WBUR, I'm your host, Darryl C. Murphy. I will talk to you next week.